Well, it is the hot button topic that has everyone talking around the state. Mitch, not just our side of the state, but north, south, east, west, everywhere you look in Illinois, people are talking about districts. And are they coming? What's good? What's bad? We'll get all into it. Are you ready for a district discussion here?
I don't know if I'm ready for it, but it's a very poignant conversation that is going to potentially alter the landscape of IHSA football. So it's important that we kind of lay out what we know, like you mentioned, maybe some pros and cons, and maybe try and answer some unanswered questions that coaches or listeners might be looking for.
Well, if we're going to lay out what we know, I think the man who knows the most about it, Steve Soucie from Friday Night Drive, is with us. He'll join us on this episode. But Mitch, let's waste no more time. Let's get into it.
Talking Illinois high school football.
If your goals are as high as you talk about, tonight's the night you go out and just take one more step.
It's a view from the West.
And it starts right now!
Welcome into View from the West podcast, the podcast covering Illinois high school football on the western side of the state of Illinois. I'm your host, Greg Armstrong, joined once again, as always, by Mitch Stormer. Mitch, here we are, the district discussion. It's got everybody talking. Are you ready to dive in?
Yeah, ready to look at this. And again, kind of like we mentioned in the cold open, there's a lot of unknown, and I think that's a big part of this conversation. But with some mock districts that have been brought up now, maybe the picture gets painted a little bit clearer, even though it's not official, but maybe gives coaches a little bit more information as to what they could potentially be supporting or against.
Yeah, well, we're hoping to inform here. And as I said, the man who knows a lot about it, the most maybe that I've seen around the state, Steve Soucie from Shaw Media, Friday Night Drives, the Seuss. Well, thank you for being here. We've been in touch over the years, but it's great to have you on the pod for the first time.
Yeah, appreciate the invitation, first of all. And, definitely one of those situations where there's been a lot brought up and a lot talking about it. It's funny that you mentioned that I might know the most about this, but there's also a frightening percentage of things that I don't know about this. So, really when it comes right down to it, I'm obviously, if you know what I do and what I have done in the past, I'm a little bit of a stickler for information collection. So this process has been really frustrating for me because I have not been able to collect all the information that I would like to do this endeavor properly.
Yeah, well, as most know who are listening to this, obviously every year, Seuss, you're drawing up the brackets. You're able to predict within about a game or two every team that's going to be in the playoff field, and you get it pretty accurate. Is this drawing up of the districts? You have projected districts, which you just released today on Friday Night Drive. I encourage people to subscribe to Friday Night Drive. First of all, it's great coverage from around the state of Illinois. You get over into our area for sure as well. So we love following it. Was trying to project the brackets easier or harder than when you just did this district mock-up?
The brackets are much easier than this.
Yeah, I suppose.
Considerably easier, especially when you get later in the season when you have all the information that you need in front of you. And I think that's the biggest difference between that process, especially at the end, and this process, because you don't have all the information that you need in front of you right now. You just don't.
Yep. All right. Well, before we jump into all of it, before we dive into the district discussion, we got to thank our friends over at Breedlove Sporting Goods, Western Illinois' premier sporting goods store for uniforms, apparel, equipment, awards, and online team stores. They provide all the same sporting goods services as the big nationwide companies, but with a faster turnaround, and their uniform pricing is a fraction of the cost you're probably used to. They offer name brands such as Adidas, Under Armour, and Nike, and are extremely responsive with any inquiries. With a primary focus on the western side of the state of Illinois, Breedlove Sporting Goods is the fastest way to outfit your team. Check them out on Facebook or at breedlovesports.com, or you can shoot Cal Breedlove an email at calbreedlove@gmail.com for more information. We also encourage you to check out Mathewson's Mini Helmets. They were our sponsor for the Mathewson's Mini Helmets Player of the Week all season long. Mathewson's Mini Helmets offers totally customized mini helmets or decals for your school. You can find them on Facebook or on Twitter. Again, that's Mathewson's Mini Helmets. We want to thank them for their support. All right, so here we are, the district discussion. we're going to break it all down. We're going to dive into it, the good, the bad, maybe some of the ugly, who it helps, who it hurts, the potential long-term consequences. I think that we also need to look into, Mitch, as you called it last week, the butterfly effect. What decisions can be made that we don't even realize the impact they can have? This is such a massive topic. Our goal today, give the listeners something that can inform and educate as much as possible. If you're an athletic director, a head coach, a fan, or a player, anyone in between, I hope that you can leave this episode knowing what you need to know before the vote is decided here. So let's jump in. It's Proposal 18, correct? I want to be officially correct. All right. So Proposal 18, submitted by Muhammad Seymour on behalf of the Apollo Conference, the Big 12 Conference, DuPage Valley Conference, and the Interstate 8 Conference. Now, what I think is interesting, Soucie, I'll ask you about it. When you look around who proposed it, it really is a good draw from around the state. You don't really get much Southern Illinois, but it is a pretty good sample of, you have Apollo, which is on the eastern side of the state. You have the Bloomington Big 12 is Bloomington Normal, Peoria, Champaign. DuPage is getting into Naperville, Aurora, DeKalb, and then the Interstate 8's kind of sprinkled in the north and central part of the state. So it really is a pretty good cross section of some bigger schools, some smaller schools, right? I mean, I think that's a good start, at least.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that when they were talking about this proposal initially, that I think they thought set it apart kind of from previous attempts at this. There was a little bit larger cross section of teams that we were talking about that kind of unified. Also, when you kind of look at those individual conferences that kind of had something to do with it, if I were to make a list of 5 to 6 conferences that have kind of had trouble maintaining a stable number, those conferences would be on the list. So you can understand, I guess, their want and their desire for, a little bit more consistency inside of their schedules.
Yep, that makes sense. Well, let's read what the official proposal says as it is written. Football districts to be formed by geography and classification. 8 districts in each class with 8 schools in each district. Now, a question we'll address soon enough is, do we have enough teams to fulfill what that says that we would get? District games would be weeks 3 through 9 of the regular season. The top 4 schools in each district qualify for the IHSA playoffs. Seating procedure will be similar to current seating procedures. Teams from the same district cannot play in the first round. So, Mitch, I guess as you've read that, as you've seen it over the past couple weeks, give me your opening thoughts. I know we've talked about districts in the past when it was first, proposed and approved and then taken back. But now here we are with a different proposal, similar, but kind of a fresh take on it. What are your opening thoughts here?
Without getting into the unknowns, which we'll get into in a minute, whenever we've talked about districts, I've been very vocally against it. I'm still there. I understand where coaches are coming from and some of the pros that come with it. I totally understand that. They're absolutely right on that. I've talked to a handful of coaches who have brought up their side of it. The coaches that I talked to, the handful that have all been on the 4 side of it. I totally understand where they're coming from. They are very valid points, but it's the way that this has been brought up. It's the way that it stands right now, and the unknowns of voting on it without knowing how this would look. I'm an absolute no on this as it sits.
Yeah. Steve, what were your thoughts when you saw it? I mean, obviously it's been discussed for a while, but when you saw this one in writing, what were your takeaways?
Well, the first thing, I think there wasn't a lot of deviation from the original, the procedure that was brought through the last time that we tried to do this. There really is not a lot of change from that proposal. The one thing that I think that they definitely improved on was the non-conference games and actually having, or the non-district games, excuse me. Actually having some factor in how the teams are seated. I think one of my biggest concerns about that previous thing was when we had the 2 non-district games that in a roundabout way didn't really count for anything. So, and that was a really big problem that I had with it, because, if you don't make the playoffs, you only get 9 of these. And then to take 2 of them and basically place no consequence or value on them, sure, maybe you're playing a rival that's not in your district, and I'm sure it means something. But in the grand scheme of things, I mean, who's to say they don't turn into glorified scrimmages in that scenario? And that was something that gave me a lot of pause. It gave a lot of people a lot of pause. So to their credit, that has improved from the previous proposal to this proposal. There is a value on those 2 games. It is a way to encourage you to seek out a quality opponent. There would be some benefit not only to playing them, but especially to beating them.
Yeah. I will say when I saw this all laid out and, the first go around, which, you pointed out, Seuss, was pretty similar to what we have now. The first go around, I'll be honest, Mitch was dead set against it. And I was kind of leaning towards thinking it was a good thing because I had seen some schools from our area that, were good programs that just were really struggling to find a home. And without having a good, solid, conference or teams around them, it really affected their year in and year out, ability to compete. And that was unfortunate. So it felt like they were programs that if they were in a right situation, they would compete. You've seen some of those schools, one being like Monmouth Roseville. They have found a conference now in the Three Rivers that really was a good fit. So now I'm kind of going, back the other way thinking, well, now that some of these schools have found homes, there's other ones that have, gone the other way. I don't know. Now I'm leaning more towards let's keep conferences the way they are. I think basically what I've realized now, the more I look at it is, and you've said it, I've heard you say it on your podcast, there is no perfect solution. There is no perfect system here that's going to please everyone. We know that. That's impossible. I think district play for some could be great. And then there are others that we'll talk about here in a minute that it would be disaster. It just will be. I can't even, it's so ridiculous. I don't even know how it would play out the way that these districts are drawn up for a couple in our area in particular. So let's kind of get into some pros and cons. We'll do just some bullet points here to kind of, map it all out, which we've kind of addressed a little bit. The pros, the good things here, schools are going to be grouped together with like size enrollment. So no more of the, question throughout the season of, they play in a really big conference and they're a small school or vice versa. There's going to be like size. So you're going to know going in a little bit more parity coming into the playoffs, right? You're going to see more like opponents, which I think is probably a good thing. One pro that I'll say that, Mitch, we haven't really talked about, it would certainly change the landscape of how we cover things on this side of the state. We've been so used to our local teams playing each other once you get into that week 3 through 9. Do you think it's an interesting scenario where we're going to see different teams? We would see a lot of different teams from around the state week in and week out. Do you like that? It makes more work for us, if it happens, but do you like that?
I mean, yeah, it's always fun to cover those, in some conferences, take the Western Big Six, their first 2 games, 3 games sometimes of the season, where we would see a Sterling versus a Wheaton St. Francis, or we would see whoever.
Yep.
It's blanking off the top of my head at the moment, but yeah, so we always enjoy that. So of course, if we stretch these out into 8 districts, of course we'd be covering more teams. That part doesn't bother me. The other side of the coin there is that for the teams themselves, and we'll get into this in a minute with like Moline,
yeah,
where they're losing all of their Quad City local opponents.
Yeah,
like that's awful. That's the worst thing that could happen for them.
Yeah, well, that's the one I was referencing, that it could be a disaster, for someone like that. A couple other, I would say, pros. It does, eliminate that drive for 5. This conference shuffling, that's the big reason we're here having this conversation, is the instability has maybe ramped up in recent years. And I think coaches and athletic directors are probably getting tired of it because it's always that jockeying, right, Seuss? There's always, every year, how many discussions do you have with teams about, we're looking for a new home, so this isn't a good fit, and we need to go here and here.
Yeah, but I think that can even be kind of a double-edged sword in the discussion of districts. Yeah, the drive for 5 is gone, but now that kind of changes to the drive for 4 inside of a group of teams that you have no control over who those teams are. You've lost your autonomy. You could end up getting placed in a much worse situation right now, and it's still the same thing. You've changed, you just changed the number and the metric on how you get there. And like I said, whatever you think of the conference system, it still provides flexibility and autonomy to the schools that are involved. It might not be perfect, but if you have a reason, whatever reason that is, for not playing a school, maybe you've had incidents with them in the past, or maybe there's just something there and you choose not to play them. This system takes away that right. And I don't know if that's necessarily something that a lot of schools in some situations are real comfortable with.
Yeah, it's interesting that as this conversation plays out, it was exactly what Mitch and I were texting back and forth when I was putting together a list of pros and cons. As soon as I would send him a pro, he would equally fire back with, on the flip side of what I just said, here's the con to that. And that's exactly what we're getting into in the conversation. So I think the next step that we've kind of talked about, these non-district games. When you build the schedule the way it is, weeks 1 and 2 would be, you're not going to have any closed districts, like we have closed conferences these days. So you would see some non-district games that could get interesting. Teams might be willing to go out, stretch their boundaries a little bit and find a fun, unique matchup. Because right, you could cross over or sizes, classes. You could go up as big as you want. So
you can do whatever you want in that situation, and it does allow for that. But as much as I hope that does create some of those games, I think there will be less of a scramble, because there'll be less of this, I have to worry about whether or not how this is going to affect my ability to get to 5. So you might be more willing to play a team that, say, went 7-2 and got to the quarters last year, if that's a reasonable distance for you to travel and all these other things. But it at least opens the door for those kinds of discussions, when in the past, maybe, I have a lot of conversations with teams looking for games now, and I'll tell them, hey, these are the 14 teams that I have not with a game in week 3 or whatever. And these people will just go down the list and go, nope, no, for whatever reason that they have.
Yeah.
And sometimes there are ridiculous size disparities, and you don't want to play that game just for safety reasons. But it will make you a lot easier to go, well, okay, let me think about that for a minute. And before, it was kind of a shut down conversation, and we might get to the bottom of that list and find 1 or 2 potential matchups that might work. And that's only if the other team is willing. And now I think that will open up the lines of conversation and provide a little bit more buy-in.
Yeah, for sure. Mitch, what do you got?
So you had mentioned that this proposal improved from the last one in terms of those 2 non-district games. What is that? What is the value then of those 2 non-district games?
Now, let's just say, for example, you went 6-3 in the regular season, and went 4-3 in district play and qualified. All right. So then you would be seeded into the bracket as a 6-3 team with the playoff points that you accumulated from your district games and those non-con games. Before, it was going to be a simple bracketing system. First place in District 1 plays 4th place in District 2. Second place plays, that would be, there would be no factoring in for any value at all for those first 2 games. So they wouldn't have counted in any capacity.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the first qualifier, though, is your record in your district in this proposal.
Once you getting into the field, you have to go in the first 4 places. Yeah. Then you're establishing, then you set your 32 qualifiers with the 4 from each 8 districts. Then you look at everyone's records. 9-0, 9-0, 8-1, 8-1. They're stacked just like they are now. All right. Even if that means a second place in some division has a better record than a first place record in another division, they're seeded that way. So that's how you could get more. Say you go 0-2, but win your district, you could be seated behind a team that finished second and won both of those games in non-con. You could conceivably be seated behind them. So that's how, that I was talking about this with somebody the other day. that's how you could conceivably be a 3-6 team and qualify for the playoffs. You could finish 3-4 in district play, win a tiebreaker for fourth place, lose both of your non-district games, finish 3-6 and make the playoffs.
Is that tiebreaker playoff points then? If two teams in the same district follow or finish with the same district record?
It would be the same thing that they would do it now. Hypothetically, if you had 3 teams finish at 3-4, all right, then it would be least points allowed in the games played between those 2 teams. So you could potentially get a lot of permutations out of that. So that's how they do it now with a 3-team tiebreak. If it was a 2-team tiebreak at 3-4, I doubt mathematically that would happen. But if it did, it would be simply head-to-head competition between those 2 teams. If it was a 4-team, it's the same thing. Setting it up against defensive points in those 3 games, figuring out who breaks that tie. So that's the like I said, someone who was asking hypothetically how that could happen. That's how it could happen.
Okay.
I read, within the notes for the proposal, I think one of their pros or one of the reasons for doing it was to streamline the playoff process. I don't know if I fully buy into that. I mean, I kind of like the way that Illinois does the high school football playoffs as is. I know that a lot of people have gripes with the, push for 5 wins and the way that seating or scheduling ends up being a huge factor and all that. But I don't know. I'll mention it. People say that streamlining the playoff process is a pro in this case.
Streamlining qualifying, I think, is what maybe they didn't articulate it very well.
Okay.
Only thing that you have to do to ensure that you're in the playoff field is finish in the top 4 in your district. You get in. Now, where you get in is up for debate, but it simplifies the whole process. You don't have to be, used to be, you would be kind of worried maybe if you were a 5-4 team with low points, whether or not you were going to get in. You'll know at the end of your district calendar on week 9 whether you're in or out. There's no question of in this system. You'll know, did I finish in the top 4? Yes, I'm in. Did I not? No, I'm out. There's no pushing the numbers around. There's no situations where, so I think that's what they were getting at there.
Okay.
Simplifying whether or not you're in or out. Like I said, I don't think they articulated as well as they could have, but that is, I think, and that to some people, not to me, because I love the chaos, but to some people, that is a definite plus. What do we have to do here? If we win on Friday night, do we finish 4th? And granted, sometimes that will be involving tiebreakers, but basically there will be a lot of games where you go into it. I win, I'm in. I lose, I'm out. And it'll be that cut and dried. And that's appealing to some people. I understand the appeal of it.
Yeah, I guess I get it, but I'm with you. I was just going to say, before you said that you loved it, I loved even this past year. I mean, you were live streaming till 2 a.m. or whatever it was, just talking about who we thought was in and how the numbers were shaking out and like crunching the numbers in real time. Like that was fun. Like that was fun, entertaining, to follow along with. So I would miss out on some of that. I think other people would miss that, but I get it. Yeah. Mitch, what do you got?
So I was just going to say before we move on, because I feel like we'll probably be hitting a lot of the more negative as we move forward. Looking
That's the cons list. Yes.
Yeah. So looking at some of the, so just to back up, we sent a survey to coaches in our area for feedback on if they would be in favor of it, what their comments were, what their thoughts are on it. So just kind of looking through, and in full disclosure, it was almost evenly split. We had 24 responses. I don't remember, Greg, what the breakdown was, but I think there was.
I think we'll get into it in a little bit, but yeah, it was a little more in favor of districts, slightly. Yeah.
Yeah. But just to go back to the first point you talked about, where you're having schools play teams of similar enrollment. The schools and conferences that we cover, where it's more of the small schools, it's more of the 1A and the 2As. We've seen a shift in the Lincoln Land, the Lincoln Land, in the track, where they are becoming conferences filled with bigger schools. So I look at 2 teams and responses that we got in, let's say, Havana or Alleman Catholic, who play in these much bigger conferences. And putting them in a little bit better of a situation where they're playing like-sized schools is certainly a benefit. Havana, who I don't believe has won a game in 2 years, Alma Catholic, who didn't field a team last year and has struggled the past few years, right? That would certainly keep them in the fold in this, where they're not trapped in a conference playing teams that are so much bigger than them. So, again, I feel like our conversation is probably going to shift a little bit, but just to put an emphasis on the pros here for those smaller schools that are in those conferences comprised of bigger programs. If you keep that, the longer you keep that up, the less interest that those communities might have. You might have less kids coming out, and that's just going to either drop you out of football entirely, like we've seen, or drop it to 8-man like we've seen. And then we're in a whole nother discussion and a whole nother set of problems. So doing this would alleviate that.
Yeah, Jeff Schmolbach from Alleman football's head coach right now, he's been very outspoken that they need districts because the landscape of Alleman has changed a lot in the past 5 years or a little bit more than that. The enrollment is significantly down to where they're essentially a 2A school, I think, now playing in a conference that is 6, 7A, on the bigger end of things. And, so they're struggling to get numbers in football. And then when you start talking about the competition they're going up against, it's a lose situation at this point. And I know people don't feel bad for Alleman around here because they've had success in the past, but this is a much different school than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. So yeah, what else have you heard from coaches, Souce, around, the state that feel like this needs to happen, that they want districts?
Well, I think there's a lot of schools that have, I guess, frustration with their inability to schedule games, primarily from the programs that are pretty successful, because we get into this at all levels, small, big, whatever. We get into this little dance. I mean, it's the chase for 5, but it's also my conference is already tough enough. Why would I go out in the non-conference schedule and schedule 2 road graders that are just going to come in and even if I split there, I'm still kind of behind the 8 ball. So it's becomes this little dance, especially with some of the stronger conferences over by where I'm at. For example, like the Southwest Suburban, where it feels like every week when you're in conference play, you've got a dynamite program coming at you. The non-conference schedule almost needs to be somewhat manageable. You can't really do that much for you. And then, I mean, just like you said about Alleman, nobody's going to shed any tears for them. But Chicago Catholic League teams, for example, are already running through a buzzsaw during the 7 weeks that they play in league. Almost every team in there is going to end up seeing 4, 5, 6 playoff caliber teams just in their conference schedule, and finding anybody willing to play them in the non-conference schedule is extraordinarily different. So, but if you kind of take the shackles of the chasing for 5, non-conference games should get a lot easier to schedule in this scenario than they are now. Should.
Yep. Well, should we move into the cons list here? I think this might get interesting, I think, because there's some things that really stand out to me. The top one that's been the big conversation is travel. Not so much I should backtrack. The travel issue is interesting because the IHSA has been outspoken in saying they don't want to go 1 through 32 in the playoff system because of travel. And now this proposal, and I get it, this proposal has been put on by coaches. So the IHSA is just going on the recommendation of the coaches and programs, in their membership pool. But if you're wanting to avoid travel, when you start looking at 7A and 8A, there are some districts that literally stretch the entire state.
Yeah, and it's a big problem in regards to how you draw these things, because a lot of people start to think about districts and they say, oh, well, we're just going to group together with, similar sized schools that are relatively close to us. That's the way that this should work, right?
Yeah.
You have to consider the fact that this policy is pretty rigid the way it's written. We need 18 districts. There's no flexibility there. we may end up not being able to have 18 districts. We'll get to that later, but right now that's the way it's written. So they have to draw them into 18 districts. And sometimes you've got one or two schools that are in the same classification for you that are 150 miles away from every other school in this state. They need to go somewhere. They have to go to somebody. So when you're looking at your map and saying, oh, these are the 7 schools that are the closest to me, not the way it's going to work. It might work that way in a few isolated situations, but you have to consider this is for everybody. It's not just for you. So those schools have to have a home too. And what it's doing is it's taking these fairly small conference circles in most situations and turning them into big giant circles to go out and grab a total of 8 teams. And the circles get bigger the smaller the classifications get.
Yeah, well, we certainly see it firsthand. Maybe the most, the team that would be impacted the most is potentially Moline. I mean, when you start looking at where they would be going week in and week out, Mitch, did you kind of look through and see what their potential district was?
Yeah, so in Seuss's mock, this would be, and again, I hate to put labels on it because it's unofficial, but so I won't. The district that Moline fell in was Quincy, a familiar opponent, but not a close draw. Normal Community, Pekin, Granite City, Collinsworth, Bellevue West, and Collinsville. I'm sorry, Bellevue West, and Alton. So
yeah,
that, and I think Coach Morrissey was pretty vocal in his response to our survey that it would be a killer for them to be in a situation like that, both financially, travel, all of that.
Well, and I thought, and he mentioned, I think is interesting, financially, it would impact them significantly. Obviously, the travel is so increased, so that's the finances there. But when you start talking about if you're losing games against, these traditional, traditional Western Big Six rivals, potentially if Galesburg's out and Quincy would still be in, but I guess you'd be having to fulfill your 2 non-district games with Rock Island and UT. That would almost be guaranteed where you'd have to go there. So you'd be able to keep them. But throughout the season, these are not teams that are nearby. They're not going to travel well. Your gates are going to be lowered, you'd think, at, home game wise throughout the season. Yeah. Have you heard that from other teams, Seuss, around the state that when they get put in these districts and they're spread out across the state, they're losing money?
Now, I've heard 2 things that are the primary concerns of one of these outlier situations. One of them, obviously, is with Moline. One is that it's going to hurt our home gates. It's going to be an expensive road trip that maybe we might have to make one of those trips a year in the current situation. Now we're going to have to make 3 of them. And that's just not very appealing. It depends on how it draws out, but those aren't good. And then other concerns that I've heard are about underclassmen programs.
Yes.
JV levels. The programs, some might have freshman levels, some might, and a lot of teams have told me we don't have any guidance on this, so we're gonna basically go back to what we were doing before. We're gonna play inside of our conferences for these underclassmen games. And I'm like, well, then what are we doing this for? Like, if we're just going to revert back to the system that we just gave up for the underclassmen route, but it's not okay to use it for the varsity level, though. We got to do it this way for that. So it just seems like complete chaos in that sense. But and I think it's more prevalent in some of the middle classifications where there's a disparity between the programs that some of these schools offer that end up in the same district. Some have JV teams, some don't. So then it's going to become this cobbling of a schedule where that becomes even worse than anything we've had to deal with at the varsity level of trying to find, teams with openings and dancing around and trying to find games. I know that happens sometimes with the larger programs, some that have freshmen and some that don't. You're playing a hodgepodge to begin with, but now you're taking away the stability and making the hodgepodge even larger, at least in that level. And nothing in the proposal addresses those concerns. Like, what are we about that?
Yeah, that was Nick Welch from United Township. That was immediately one of the things he pointed out.
There was a lot that had that point in our survey.
Yep. So
another officials too. Like a lot of these areas have officials that are kind of moored in an area. I mean, are they going to be willing to make these, 2-hour trips for games to fulfill, the obligations that these schools need? Is that infrastructure as shaky as to be with? I don't think we want to put more instability into that equation.
yeah, absolutely. That's a great point as well. So, some of the other drawbacks, the cons that we would, we mentioned, teams are going to lose control of their schedule. The IHSA would be responsible for scheduling districts year in and year out. Have we heard, Seuss, would it be on a 2-year interval? Do we know that? I know other states have done it that way.
I think this is what I believe would happen. I believe, and this is all speculation because I am not, I mean, if this policy was implemented, we would be in a 1-year pocket because it would be the last year of the 2-year enrollment period.
Okay.
Right. And then it would go into place for a 2-year pocket after that because we would get new enrollment numbers. There's going to be some situations, and I've already been informed of a few of them. Possible co-ops that are dropping. I've heard of one program today that I didn't know about that apparently is going to go to 8-man football. I knew about one of those already, but I found out another one. There's just variables right now that would change it, I think, in some ways. But as far as existing multipliers, success formula, playing up, all of those things that are currently in place and were in place for 2023 would be in place for 2024, and then everything would get recalculated in 25 and 26. So you'd have potentially new classifications because of multiplier number changes, enrollment changes, all this other stuff. So the numbers that I use to calculate this projection would most likely be good for 24 with some slight adjustments, but then you throw everything back in the hopper for the 25-26 seasons. That's what I believe.
Yeah, well, and I guess that would make sense based on the way the IHSA has gone in those 2-year intervals to begin with. That would make sense to kind of feed this into that system that is already in place. So, a couple of things we've talked about. You're going to lose those potential built-in rivalries that these conferences have created. Nearby schools that are a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller than each other. The biggest one in our area, Rock Island and Moline. They'd play in week 1 or week 2. But I know looking around our area, you got to imagine, Mitch, that there's other teams that won't be able to fulfill that rivalry game inside of their 1 or 2 non-district games. That there's going to be local games that are missed out on, whether they were the biggest rivalry in the state or just kind of a nearby, clash between 2 schools that play each other a lot, that we're going to bring a big gate, was going to bring a big draw. They're not going to happen. We're eventually going to lose some of those. And even if they play in weeks 1 or week 2, I know they still mean something for seeding, but doesn't it lose a little bit of a luster if Moline and Rock Island play in week 1?
Yeah, a little bit. Especially since, and again, as Seuss cleared up earlier, that those non-district games will still count for something. But those, when you had those matchups of recently in the Western Big Six, Moline and Sterling coming down to week 9. It determined the conference 2 years ago. It determined who was going to the playoffs this year. So, yeah, it absolutely loses its luster. I will say, based on some of the mock-ups by Seuss, we retain some of that. Certainly in 1A, in the 1A North, essentially the NUIC district, we retain a lot of that. You get Morrison and Newman back together. You get Morrison and Fulton back together. In 2A, you would have Rock Ridge and Mercer County back together. With Orion in there too. So we do retain some of it, but yeah, it wouldn't have the same feel, and it wouldn't have the same implications that we've seen it have the past couple seasons.
Yeah.
Remind me before we go that there's a fun little wrinkle to that 1A, 2A situation that I'd like to do when we're done. So,
all right. Oh, a wrinkle
it's not even in the story. This is a whole new
That's a tease.
I just want to throw it out there for you before we're done. Just remind me to do that.
Love it. All right, we'll get back to that. So we talked about the playoffs being streamlined, but Seuss, do you see potential issues where some of these districts are going to be drawn up and there's just going to be imbalances, with clustered areas of good teams. And then the district right next to them is a cluster of teams that are lacking that success. And I know that can happen in the current conference setup, but for the most part, schools were choosing which conferences they were going to be in. And I felt like it would all kind of equal out. We knew some conferences were better than others, but in the grand scheme of things, I think the way this system is built, you could really see some imbalance. And I think that leads to maybe not the best playoff field, correct?
Yeah, I think there's some of that. I think it's kind of it's a hard thing to describe, but I will say one thing, that when you're looking through this, a lot of the schools that you find typically on the bubble, between classifications, particularly in the middle, like 4, 5, and 6, if you're looking at it, you're going, I'm used to that team being a 5. Why are they in the 6? What I'm used to this team being a 4. Why are they a 5? Well, that's because of the construction of saying, hey, 64, that's it. 64 here, 64 here, 64 here. Because over time, like if you look at this, like at the end of the season, and I do this every year just as an exercise, not even because of these district things. If you counted from the top of the enrollment sheet, the smallest school, and started working down, most years you have to get to about 80 on the sheet before you find the 1A, 2A break line. All right.
Okay. Yep.
Think about that in that construct.
Yeah.
Just putting 64 in 1A before. So now that's going to change. It's going to push around the teams that are likely getting in. All right. That number is not quite as high as 80 for the next classification, but it's still fairly high. It's like 72. All right.
Okay.
Then as we go down, that number slowly gets smaller and smaller and smaller. All right. So that's why you're seeing this, is because those schools that are on the bubble in the current system between 2 and 3, they have to get pushed down because of that fact right there. So that's what you're seeing, is you're seeing teams get bumped down in almost every situation, all the way up to about 7. It tapers off at 8. All right, because 8's pretty locked in. I mean, typically I can look at the last teams on the sheet and say, these out of the playoff field is going to come out of these 48 teams, and almost be right every single time. That's just because that's where the stronger programs lie. And they also, it's one of the negatives of the current system. The 8As tend to feast on the 7As and the 6As in non-conference. Overall, it doesn't happen all the time. There are some struggling 8A programs too, but for the most part, when you have a non-conference game between two middle of the pack 8 and 6A teams, the 8A team almost always wins. And that's it becomes this. I told someone before, a lot of what I do is big math. It's not complicated math, it's big math. There's a difference.
Yeah. So that it's funny you mentioned that, because I immediately noticed that when I saw Geneseo and Sterling were paired together in 5A, correct?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. And traditionally Geneseo's been 4 and Sterling plays up at 5. So that was one that I immediately noticed. So when you getting back to this playoff system, what worries me is we used to see it in Iowa when I was covering, in the Quad Cities, covering the Iowa side of the river, that there's potential for a team to qualify for the playoffs because they finished 4th in their district. And like you said, they could finish at 3 and 6, correct?
Yes, it is possible.
So if that happens, there's a chance that that team gets in at 3 and 6, while other districts have a 4 and 5 team that gets left out, potentially, right?
Yes. There's also, there also could potentially be a scenario where a 5 and 4 team got left out and a 3 and 6 team got in, because you could potentially go 3 and 4 in district play and finish 5th and win both of your non-conference games. So you could finish 5 and 4, 3 and 4 in district play, and finish behind 7 and 0, 6 and 1, 5 and 2, 3. So you could finish 5th, miss the playoffs, have a 5 and 4 record, not get in. That could happen.
Souce, you officially gave Mitch a headache. He needs Tylenol here. You're killing him.
I hate it.
Yeah. And that's a possibility.
That's bad. Yeah, that would be bad. And I think,
Go back to that 1A North. You've got, I think I counted 24 state championships in that mock district. Okay.
Yep.
One of those teams, possibly two of those teams, are going to be left out every single year with this model.
Correct.
And you're going to tell me that let's just pick on.
Oh, go to the
Pick
Chicago district right next to it.
Right. Pick on Forreston and say they finish 5th in the district. You tell me that Forreston's not better than 85% of 1A? Like, I hate it. I hate it.
My thing with it, when I look at that just in general, like when we're talking about that 1A situation, is I'll take it a step further. You take the 6th place. I'll take the 6th place finisher in District 1 against the runner-up in District 2 every time. And not only will I take them, I'd take them to win in a running clock.
Which one is that again?
1A. I'm looking at 1A.
Yeah.
I'll take the 6th place finisher on any given year. All right. And I'll put them up against, just for safety's sake, the 3rd place finisher in District 2. And I'll take them to win by a running clock. Every single.
Yeah. Yeah. Because let's put this in person. Let's, say the names on the list here. You have Forreston, Fulton, Lena Winslow, Morrison, Newman. One of those teams is not making the playoffs.
Yeah.
In this current setup. And that's ridiculous because all those teams are going to be very good football teams.
Right.
Yeah. That's where I feel like that's one of the other huge drawbacks here is I think the current setup for the playoffs works pretty well. You're getting year in and year out, and you would know Souce as good as anybody. You're getting is it what, 256?
Yes.
You're getting the best 256 teams. Usually there might be some argument once in a while that a 3-6 from a really good conference didn't make it in, but right. You'd agree that the most part, it's getting it right every year.
I think for the most part, I think there are times when I look at it and I say, well, boy, that conference was a lot deeper than it usually is. These guys in an average year, probably get to 6-3 or something, but this caught some bad breaks. They finished 3-6. They're probably better than half, if not all, of the 5 and 4 qualifiers. It happens. It does definitely happen, but it doesn't happen that much. I think, especially now with less teams, and if you've played a strong schedule, we had 6 4 and 5 teams get into the playoffs this year with strong schedules. And I think that trend's only going to increase if we stay in the current system, as we lose a couple more teams each year to 8-man, consolidation, whatever. I think that's only going to increase. So the number of times where I feel like the current system has egregiously kept a really good football team out by its process, that list is really short.
Yeah. And I worry that, just when you lay out, especially in Class 1A, we just mapped it out. I worry that we're moving away from that. We're taking a step back in that area. Talk about the big issue here with all of this, district talk, is that it's all based around 512 teams. And as it currently sits, we don't have that. We're not getting to 512 based on who was playoff eligible from a year ago. So describe a little bit about how you got to the 512, and that involves some Chicago public league teams that for whatever reason they choose not to be involved in the IHSA playoff system. Kind of give us a little bit of, insight into that.
Well, I mean, when it comes right down to it, at the end of last year, we finished with 497 playoff eligible teams. So basically what we had that, okay. We had 2 teams in Southern Illinois, Vienna, and I'm drawing a blank, Sparta, that were scheduled to start their seasons and then elected not to. But for the purposes of this exercise, I put them back in. I don't know what their future is. I reached out to both of those schools. I did not get a response. Another school that I reached out to is obviously one in your area. Alleman confirmed that if the district situation was voted in, that they would be planning on returning to varsity football. And then an 8-man program. A school has indicated that they're definitely going to 8-man in West Carroll. So with them going there, after you do all that math, that puts you at 500 teams. I put Sparta and Vienna back into the field just for convenience sake. That might be wrong, but that's one of these variables that I just don't know yet. So 500 is not 512, obviously. Mm-hmm. So in order to do this, to get a picture of what's going on, the proposal gives no guidance on what they would do if they're short of 512 or don't or have more than 512. It doesn't tell us what we're going to do with that possible situation. So as it stands, there are 24 teams in the Chicago Public League that are not playoff eligible. I don't count all of them as possible teams to go into this field, because I believe four, maybe five had multiple forfeits this season. So I don't like the stability of them moving forward. So what I did, those teams are broken into divisions of 6. So I basically took the top 3 finishers in each of those 4 divisions and moved them into the thing so I could get to 512, because I wanted to see what it would look like. Now, that comes with some peril, because I don't know if that's what they'll do. And no one knows. I mean, no one knows the answer to that right now. The Public League doesn't know who those teams would be that they would put into this system. The proposal submitters don't know what teams are going to be put in this. In fairness to them, they don't know what teams are going to be put in this system. But as it stands, we don't have 512 teams. So to get to 512, that's what I chose to do. I could be completely dead wrong on which 12 teams. Maybe they don't take them at all. Maybe there's an alternate to it. Then how do we decide which class gets 62 teams and which class gets 60 teams? Or how does that get decided? No one knows the answers to those questions either. So like I said in that story today, I had to take some liberties, and this was the liberty that I chose to take to give us kind of a snapshot of what this could look like. And what you have to understand is the teams I choose are very important, because if I choose a team with a 2A enrollment over a team with a 4A enrollment, it changes the landscape of those. If I switch those around, it changes the landscape in 4, 3, and 2, because you have to take a team in 4, replace whoever you're replacing, and move them down. Move that team down into 3. It changes all the maps unless there's a straight swap of the team you just took out of 3 and replaced in there. So you may have to change every one of the district maps depending on who you bring in to replace. And then it happens again in 2A for that vacancy. So if I guessed wrong and the team that is in the field is a 5A and it's all the lines change, all the teams change, potentially all the regions change. So it's so delicate. And that's the thing about it, is if they come back to the table and say, no, we're putting Fenger in instead of Corliss, and there's a 300 enrollment difference in them, then tear up the sheets, start over. So that's where it becomes really, really delicate here. And like I said, it was irritating in the process, but nobody, and I understand why no one has the answer, but what do we do here? I mean, if we have 5, if we go to battle with 500, how do we decide? And like we were talking about before, some of these class breaks have fascinating teams on them, resting on one side or the other. Their fate could be decided, which classification they're in, on whether or not the Public League sends a full complement of teams into this playoff system. So that's where this became really, really tricky. I think I explained my logic in the story of how I got to what I got to fairly well, but I could 100% be wrong on that and render this entire exercise moot, to be completely honest with you.
Yeah, but I mean, just to have eyes on any sort of, projection. If I'm an athletic director or a head coach, this is great. This is something I absolutely need to see. Because I think my biggest issue with all of this, going back to when it when I first heard about it is, I tweeted out when it first came out, when my biggest problem with the plan is that there is no plan. Is that like, and I get why the IHSA isn't going to quickly draw up, the brackets draw up the districts. I get why they can't do it because this is a member proposal. So it feels like I wish the members that proposed it would have had at least a little bit more insight to the details. But I guess that, that takes a lot of work. That takes a lot of effort. And I think that it's something they didn't either have time to do or just didn't care to go into the detail. I don't know. I think that's my biggest issue with all this is there's so many unknowns. If I'm a member voting on this, even if I think I like it, I don't know how I vote for it because I don't really know what I'm voting for. Mitch, what are you thinking here?
I was just gonna say like that it would be forced to be drawn quickly because they want to have this in place for the next football season. So it would have to be drawn quickly and haphazardly. It would have to be.
And that's my other concern is that the way this has been proposed and said very firmly that it's going to be installed in 24, it just seems like we're rushing this whole process when we saw how this played out once. It was voted in, then people saw what the IHSA drew up and they didn't like it. The member schools didn't like it and we scrapped it. And I get that's probably frustrating for people who really want district play to be put into place. But I think, can't we learn something from that first go around and really do the homework? Let's work the due diligence to get it, at least to something that we know what we're voting on. So I guess here's the, go ahead, Mitch.
If the members vote for it, but then they don't like how the IHSA drums it up, does it matter? I mean, there's nothing that can happen if the members vote for it.
You can't pull it back. And this is what, when I was talking to Sam Knox about this at the IHSA, he was honest about it. He's like, I mean, we're not going to put out a mock of this because there are so many variables that could be proven incorrect between here and there. So I think the onus falls on the people that are submitting the proposal to do some convincing here that what we're doing here is actually is better. There's a lot of, you need to take it on faith that this is better for us. And ultimately the IHSA is going to, if they get the go ahead to do this, is they're just going to feed the stuff into the computer, and whatever the computer spits out is what we're going to get. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. So no, there's no eject button on this plane, if you will. If it's passed, it's coming. And the only way to get it back or something different would be put it through the next legislative process. But if it votes through if the vote comes down on the 19th and says, we're playing this, we're playing it. In 24, we're playing it.
Well, and I think the biggest, point that when you sat down and talked to Jim Taylor about it from WRMJ Radio, his point that he really drove home was, once you make this decision, there's really no going back. It's almost impossible to think that you'd go back to conference play once you did a year or two in districts. So that's the terrifying part. And I just think, I know there's some schools around the state that they know they want district play for one reason or another. They know why they want it, and they're convinced that the teams that are going to be drawn up in their district are going to be beneficial to them, and they're going to go for it. But if I'm anywhere on the fence, if I have even the slightest question about this, I don't know how you can vote it in with this many unknowns, because we talked about the potential imbalance for these districts, and there seems to be no indication that we would take like success factored into it to where, okay, these teams have been playoff teams perennially, so let's try to make some competitive balance. There's been no talk of that. So like you said, your mock-ups here are just drawn up based on geography and enrollment and like enrollment. And that, to me, that doesn't work. It works for some, but in the grand scheme of things, I just think there's too much imbalance that's going to be created here. And it just, I don't know how it's going to work. So we've kind of talked all through it here. Should we start looking through and, just kind of, looking broadly at the districts you drew up, Souce? Again, to anyone listening to this, go check out Friday Night Drive, subscribe to them. Souce has all the mock projected districts mapped out. Great work here. And I think what I really love, and I'm being serious when I say it, that this is an absolute testament to local journalism here, is that no one else around the state could draw up a projection, and you were able to do it, and you took the time to do it. So, go support local journalism here, because this is the work being done to give people an idea.
Yeah, I appreciate that. But I mean, for me, it was, I feel like, I'm not going to say I'm anti this proposal. I just don't think it's better than what we currently have. Do I think that district football could work? Yes, I do. Do I think it works in this plan? No, I don't. And that's the thing. I just wanted I felt like everyone kind of needed to be informed of what we were dealing with. And when it became clear that we were not going to be informed, basically in the way that I maybe thought that it should have been, I felt like, I don't want to say I felt like it was my responsibility to do it, but I just felt like everyone would be better served if we at least had some sort of picture to look at, so people that maybe didn't understand the process at all could at least be somewhat informed when they were making their vote. If you're for it, that's fine. And I understand that there are a lot of programs that benefit from this situation. I get it. I just don't think I've said this about 100 times in the process of this. Are we fixing problems, or are we shifting problems? That's what I think it is. I think we're fixing some problems in this situation for some programs, but I think we're shifting the onus of those problems to different programs in the state. And I just, if that's the case, then I mean, are we really making it better for everybody, or just better for some? That's where I really kind of come down on the issue.
Yeah. Mitch, anything else before we kind of, look at these projections here?
I apologize if we talk about this, because I know that this is also another proposal. But if the multiplier stays, how does that get factored in? I mean, would you see? And I know we talked about this a little bit before about teams that are maybe bordering classes, but if that success factor is still applied, would you see teams switching districts every 2 years or whatever the refresh is?
Basically, there was discussion of a change to the way that the multiplier was going to be calculated. That didn't make the ballot. So
okay,
everything that is applied now basically remains the same. Like, all the multipliers are the same. The formula for how we calculate multipliers going forward stays the same. The success formula stays the same. So, for example, people were asking a lot in the state finals, do we get the, since Nazareth has won back-to-backs and Mount Carmel has won back-to-backs, do they get moved up a class by success formula? No, they don't, because it's not in the 2-year window. So it resets after each 2-year window. So now that number starts over again. And I understand how that's confusing to some people, but basically all the things that are in place to sort the teams by enrollment currently stay in place in this system. Nothing changes in regards to how multipliers are calculated. The only way that any of that could change would be as if someone suggested a bylaw change to how the multiplier is calculated, and it goes through the legislative process, it passes, and then we go from there. So all that stuff for how we get the teams where we get them is going to be exactly the same.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's start in the big schools here. Class 8A, and, to a certain extent, also Class 7A here is a little bit more in our area with Moline and Quincy. But man, I mean, it's pretty obvious when you look at that 8A district setup. You have all the collection of teams from Chicago and Chicagoland area, followed by Edwardsville, Belleville East, and there's one other school down there. Who else? O'Fallon?
Yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, that's the glaring thing right there. What else stood out to you when you went through 8A here? I mean, as far as schools are grouped pretty nearby, what's the competitive balance look like?
It's not like if you were going to make me say, okay, which class do you think is most livable in this section? What could you live with the easiest? It might be this one. Now, there's obviously that glaring problem in District 8. And I know that with, it's not fair to Minooka, Joliet West, Joliet Central, Plainfield. It is absolutely not fair to them to basically be telling them for all of time, you're going to be district partners with these, because I mean, if this is your map, this is your map. Now, I might be slightly off on that. They might end up taking one other team, but I think I'm on point. I think that's the way it would probably be done. And even if I'm not right and it is another team, that's still going to be a god awful commute for whoever that is.
Yeah, it's just unbelievable.
Go back to that discussion before. You can't leave those teams out on an island. You just can't do it. I saw somebody mock the top 64 enrollment teams in football, and they took those teams out because they're like, well, it won't work that way. Well, what are we kicking them out of the IHSA? I mean, what are we doing? I mean, they need to have a home, just like all of the other 59 teams in this classification. So that's the only way you can make it work. I mean, I suppose you could change up the teams and you could justify it in some way, but those by geography are the closest 5 teams to link with those 3. And that's where for all the arguments that you have about the conference system, that's where the conference system really works. Like the Southwestern Conference works for those teams. There might be some teams that struggle more than the other one, but from a logistics standpoint, it works so much better than this does, because all it does with those Southwestern teams, you break them apart and they're all geographical outliers to everybody else. They all become these little rogue teams that you have to link into the other ones and cause road trips or, massive trips for them coming back up this way. So yeah, but other than that, it's the one classification that I think you can look at it and say, okay, I see how this could play out and be okay. I mean, I highlighted the playoff teams from this year. That's not a great indicator, I guess, long term of how I have a better indicator, but I won't go into that right now. It describes, but I have a 3-year win metric, and I actually have it colored. So I show where it's like green and red, which means these are the teams that are historically good. These are the teams. This color pattern is not that bad. Like there's balance here. Like other ones, yeah.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I get back to there needs to be some factor, I think, for competitive balance. I think they have to take a look at that. And I'm worried that if this gets passed in this kind of rush setup, that they won't have time to get into that. And it's not drawn in right now. So it would have to be almost like, would they have to vote on a change to it? Or I don't know, like down the road, if they wanted to get to competitive balance model, how they would do that, how it would draft. It wouldn't help the travel any, or it shouldn't. It probably wouldn't help all the travel. But I don't know. I just think there has to be something factored in there, like you mentioned, kind of like long-term, who's been playoff teams and whatever. Looking at 7A, very similar issues. You with a few more schools tossed in. Pekin and Normal Community in the middle of the state, Moline and Quincy on the western side of the state, and then way down south, Alton, Granite City, Bellevue West. Who else is in the Collinsville lumped in there? Again, we talked about it earlier. One of the biggest teams impacted here is Quincy and Moline from our area. Two programs that would be drastically, affected here. Mitch, this is probably. Oh, go ahead.
No, it's like I said. But once again, we get back to that discussion of, hey, these teams have to go somewhere. Yeah, and I mean, I'm not going to have, for example, an alternative was like, okay, well, maybe you bring Bradley into that district instead of Moline. Well, then Moline's still got to come all the way back to Chicagoland to get whatever district they're in. So either way, they're kind of out there on the Moline Island, at least when you're talking about 7A as a standalone. And that's what you have to get your head wrapped around. Yeah, some of these schools are not on an island, but their neighbors are 6As and 8As, and it doesn't work in the system. That's the lack of flexibility in it is what's going to crush it.
Yeah. Mitch, I'm sure this is probably part of the reason, on the bigger end of things, why you hate this district proposal is that it really eliminates the rivalries that we follow week in and week out in the Western Big Six. And it creates these schedules that, I don't know, no offense, it doesn't do anything for me to see Alton, Belleville West, Collinsville, Granite City coming to Moline every year. It doesn't matter to me.
And it's a 4-hour trip.
Well, yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And then again, it's to Coach Morrissey's point that it's just going to kill them financially, whether they host that game. No one from Granite City is coming up at that game. They won't get the crowd that they get from a UT game, from a Rocky game, from a whatever game.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's just these teams that are on islands. It sucks for them, and it also sucks for the teams that have to be pulled in with them.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is, again, situations like this. I feel like the negatives of situations like this outweigh the positives of some of the other things that we've talked about. Some of the pros here, I think cons such as this play a bigger role into the stability of the IHSA system.
Souce, what's your general sense as far as some of these bigger schools? Do they want it? Do they not want it? I mean, I look at, I guess, one of the questions but prompted me to ask the question based on like Chicago Catholic League schools. You got, St. Rita, Brother Rice, being separated, and you look around the list and they're kind of all spread out, obviously. What do they think about it?
I don't think in general they're in favor of it at all. I get the general sense that this doesn't apply for everyone, but I think a large chunk of Chicagoland is not for this policy.
Yeah.
And I think most of the genesis of that comes from situations that this is creating. It's like you just mentioned, Brother Rice, St. Rita, and Mount Carmel are split in this projection. While I'm sure they don't necessarily enjoy bashing one another's heads in on a regular season, I think they'd rather be playing one another, than playing, for example, the district that I have St. Rita and Mount Carmel in, that has Argo, Kenwood, Lincoln Park, Oak Lawn, Revis, and Whitney Young along with them. No offense to any of those schools, and Kenwood's been a pretty good public league school, but that's not nearly the schedule that Mount Carmel and St. Rita are accustomed to playing. It's not the schedule that they want to play.
And it's not bringing in those traditional year in and year out rivalry type games or those marquee matchups, right? That's what the Chicago Catholic League produces. You're going to miss out on some of those inevitably. Mitch, what do you got?
I was just going to say that you can, we're talking about Nazareth winning the title. You can talk all you like about what class that they should play in or whatever. I don't think they win that title regardless if they don't play the schedule that they playing the opponents that they did. I mean, that says something, that they were 4-5 and the talent that they played put them initially in maybe a tough spot sitting there at 4-5, but in the end, how can you argue against it that those types of games prepared them for that run and to win that title again?
Yeah. Moving along to 6A, I thought the 6A district that was drawn up with our local schools wasn't quite as bad as maybe what I thought it might be. It's District 7, according to your mock-ups here, Souce. Dunlap out of the Peoria area with United Township, Galesburg, Normal West, Peoria High, Richwoods, Rock Island, and Washington. So pretty much a, Peoria, Quad Cities kind of conference with the, Normal West thrown in there. That isn't.
Yeah, this is one of the maps though that, like, while you're saying it doesn't look that bad for you, it drives me bananas because it has something that I don't ever believe that the IHSA would actually do, but I can't find a solution for it. Look at Bloomington and Normal West.
Oh, you're right. Wow. Yeah, that's crazy.
Tell me how to do it differently. You have to have 8 in each one. What do I do?
Yeah, wow. If you're listening to this podcast, go look at that 6A map. And yeah, you're right. You're absolutely kind of stuck there based on the teams in 6A. Where do you go? Yeah, what do you do?
What's the solution? I mean, that's what I mean. I can find one in my head. It's kind of weird, but I mean, but it involves like potentially moving East Moline and and push them over to 1. But then I got to move other teams around, and it doesn't logistically work. It's very, and this is where I get in the whole rigid 8 number. That's because like I don't genuinely believe they would split Normal West and Bloomington, but I also can't come up with a solution that doesn't have them doing that.
Yeah.
Can't come up. I've tried. I've looked at it for an hour just staring at it.
Yeah, and just looking at especially that 7 and 8 that you have there. I mean, East St. Louis is kind of the outlier where you have to go so far to the west, where you're having teams in other districts just so much closer.
I mean, I suppose in theory you could end up doing some sort of weird east-west line, but that's, I mean, I guess I can see one right now, but I'm trying to figure out how. No, I'm lying to myself. I can't. I'm looking at it, and it's just, you got that 3 clump around Springfield. You got East St. Louis down there that has to be dragged in. Centennial and Danville have to go somewhere. I mean,
wow.
It's a wacky little thing. I mean, that you can't do it without driving over someone and not making it. Doesn't make sense. So that's where you get into this whole, when we had that discussion earlier about, you think to yourself, oh, these are the 8 teams that are closest to me. Well, okay, but they're not the 8 teams closest to someone else. So that's it just kind of becomes this chain reaction when you're trying to put together maps. But yeah, I agree with you. From your perspective, it looks reasonable. But then when you take into that other little element there, maybe it doesn't.
I had not even noticed. Yeah, that Normal West, I hadn't even seen that until you called out the map. So
yeah, every time I look at 6A, I blanch. I'm just like, oh, I don't like the way that looks. But I've yet to come up with a solution.
So looking at 5A, so 5A was what stood out to me when I read through it initially, because Geneseo's sitting there at 5A. You explained earlier how they end up in 5A, which makes total sense. They are paired up with Sterling, which I think they got to love. Those two have been rivals for years. They've stayed together conference-wise over the years. They both moved to the Western Big Six at the same time. So I think they have to be thrilled with that pairing there. And ultimately for them, for both schools, it does match them up with schools that are fairly close. And obviously enrollments are fairly close because that's the whole point here. So the district setup, I think, does work for Sterling and Geneseo, right, Mitch? I mean, it doesn't help us any because they're not playing local schools to us, but it does work for them. I can see why they would like it.
Well, is that some of the schools of the former NIC conference there?
What it would have been the NCIC or the big, NCIC, was it Northern, was it NIB, the Northern Illinois Big 12 or something?
It was, I don't remember, but you see similar opponents there. So
Rochelle was definitely in it. Sycamore was in a conference with Sterling at one point. So yes.
Yeah. So for them, it's not awful, I wouldn't say.
Yeah. How about a chance to see Metamora and Morris in the same district? That is, depending on the year, and you're talking about two of them. And Muhammad Seymour, who drafted up, was a big one who drafted up the proposal. That's an interesting one. And what do you think Soucie Joliet Catholic thinks about the potential of being put there in District 5?
Yeah, I can't imagine that's going to be well received.
Yeah.
The thing that I guess kind of jumps off the page at me in 5A is, you talked a lot about District 1, and I don't know this for a fact, but it was kind of confirmed to me, we're probably still, unfortunately, staying in 1 to 16s. So I drew these districts with the idea that 1 through 4 are your North districts, 5 through 8 are your South districts.
Yeah.
So that's the way I did this here. And when I look at District 2, District 3, and District 4, boy, there's just not a lot of depth in those divisions. Look at District 3, for example. I mean, Glenbard South was a pretty solid football team this year, but they also had a Notre Dame recruit at wide receiver that kind of brought them up to a level above what they're used to. But that's Nazareth and St. Francis and a whole lot of mess in District 3.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
And then District 4 is, oh my gosh. Like, we had 4 playoff qualifiers, but 2 of them are from the public league. That division is guaranteeing that 2 public league schools are qualifying every year, if that's the way it held up. You know, and there are good public league teams. I'm not saying there aren't. Morgan Park in District 5, very good. That group is not a very good cross section of public league schools, but every year there's going to be 2 qualifiers out of there, and then there's also going to be 2 schools that are going to qualify every year, no matter what. Evergreen Park and St. Lawrence will make the playoffs every single year if that this sketched out.
Yeah,
they will never fail to make the playoffs.
Yeah, and you just mentioned it, and I want to go on a tirade here. If we how can we possibly justify staying 1 through 16 brackets when we're potentially looking at passing something where teams are traveling around the state every week of the regular season? How we can't justify that. There's no way. It's ridiculous.
Well, I was a little flippant when I asked somebody on the proposal on whether or not why that wasn't an addendum included in there, because it seems to be this is what everybody wants.
Yes.
So if you have the opportunity to put that on there, just throw it on there as a writer, and it goes through, and then it's out of the IHSA's hands. Because if this proposal is going through, if that's part of the proposal, then we have to do it. And I think they just kind of caved on it and said, well, we'll leave that to the IHSA's discretion. That's how it was described to me. So they had the opportunity to say, hey, no, this is what we want, and they didn't do it. So it's still at the IHSA's discretion, and I still believe that they're going to continue to do it the way that they're doing it.
And there's no way they can justify it. There's no rationale to justify it anymore if this district gets approved. Mitch, you were so close to having a silver lining for a district proposal that you don't like, and it's been taken away.
Even that, I don't think would have. If that was part of this, I don't think I would change my stance on it, though.
Oh, yeah, I figured, but
it would. Now, if it passes, it would change. It would be something, sure, but it still wouldn't be like, well, okay, that's good. It just, I don't think you could change my mind on it, truthfully.
Yeah. All right. Anything that stood out to you, Souce, in 4A as we go down? Any kind of outliers or different things that were weird here?
Well, I mean, the biggest one for me is, once again, it's another one of those situations where we've got an influx of public league schools, and historically a lot of not really good ones. And I think this is where you start to see some situations where you can lock in a couple of schools before the season even starts and into the playoffs.
I mean, like even IC Catholic.
Yeah. I mean, and IC Catholic does not want to play that schedule.
No, that's what I was just going to say. They can't like this.
Like what their drawing card is, we're trying to develop, our program to the point where, we're going to be producing college level caliber athletes, and yet you're going to be playing a quarter. And I'm not exaggerating. They're playing a quarter before they've run out their freshman team, because that's the level of competition that we're talking about here. I mean, that schedule would be potentially ridiculous. And then, does it get much better in District 3, District 4? You don't have the clear outlier like you do with IC Catholic, but I mean, Cole City, I mean, you want to give them a District 4 championship plaque for the next
automatic.
I mean, that's where we're at. And then, that's what I look at here, and that's where I get really troubled is, it's the same. It's a similar argument to got to put them somewhere. They're involved, but I think a better way to go about this would have been to say, okay, we're going to dedicate. We've got 16 public league schools in this. We're going to dedicate 2 divisions to them. It's not ideal, but interspersing them amongst the other schools is damaging in 2 ways, both to the strong programs that have to play them and the weaker programs that have to compete in those situations.
Yeah.
It's why separating the CPL as we do right now is the best thing for everyone involved.
Yeah.
Because no offense to them, I'm for everyone playing football that they can, but history has shown over and over and over again, we've got so much evidence to this point. They're not ready to compete at that level. This system would force them to. And that's not great, because not only are the playoffs for the problems that they have, those are at least the teams that proved that they were at least okay enough to get 5 or 6 wins. In some of these situations, you're drawing IC Catholic with teams that haven't won game 3 years. I mean,
yeah.
That's why I'm saying when I advocate for the conference system, that's what I advocate for. It has done a pretty decent, not in all accounts, but a pretty decent job of ferreting out and kind of shifting teams to where they largely belong.
Yeah.
This system takes none of that stuff into account. It doesn't take any of it into account, and that's where I have a lot of problems with it.
And you referenced it, I think, earlier, but the Chicago Public League, you don't get the sense wants anything to do with the district football model.
I don't think they do. But also the thing that you have to keep in mind, and I don't mean to slight anyone there, but history also shows that they have not been real invested in the voting. They're just kind of like whatever hand you deal us, and we'll do whatever. And so they don't often like, I would think if they voted in a block and said, hey, this is what we believe, they could engineer just about almost any topic that they wanted to. There are 85, 90 schools in the Chicago Public League that if they voted as a block and said, this is what we want, they could steer almost any legislative thing that comes along. But they don't do that. Because if you notice in past votes, we don't have a full threshold of all the schools that are playing football that actually voted. Doesn't happen.
Yeah. Yep.
I don't know where the votes are coming from, but a lot of times I know where they're not coming from. So that's what it really comes down to. But yeah, do I get there are a few and they tend to be the better programs that are like, sure, we'll take on this challenge. I know for a fact, I know Morgan Park is for it. They want it.
Yeah.
Because they want that level of competition, and they can hang. They can hang in their district. If I had to project right now who gets out next year in that district, I would pick Morgan Park. I would say they would get out of District 5. They would qualify. But I don't think all this, I could say that about very many other Chicago Public League schools in this situation.
Yeah. We talked about, obviously, IC Catholic, their potential setup here. On the opposite side, Rochester is down there in District 6 in the mock-ups. I'm not exaggerating. I struggle to find a team on either side that could challenge IC Catholic or Rochester year in and year out. I just think if these districts hold, I think you see that state championship every year.
I think you're probably right. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And I've talked to Coach Leonard about this at Rochester, and it's one of the reasons that he's not on board with this.
Yeah.
He doesn't want it because they've cultivated a schedule where they play 5A, 6A teams all season long. And some of them give them a little bit of a push. Sacred Heart Griffin obviously gives them a little bit of a push, and they would still play them in a rivalry game, I'm sure, but not the same thing like we were talking about before. But it's just, even when you look at District 6 as I have it drawn, 6 of those 8 teams qualified for the playoffs. But I have no doubt in my mind, if you said project it, what do you think is going to happen? Rochester goes on the 1 line, and they go on the 1 line every year to start
Yeah.
the season for as long as, if we're doing this system, for as long as we do it.
Yeah, that's what stood out to me as soon as I looked at it. Like, all right, in 3A, we got a lot of schools from our area here. District 1, Byron, the state champion, defending state champion, they would be in a district with Dupec, who we've covered from the Northwest Upstate Illini. Obviously know them very well. Genoa Kingston, Marion Central Catholic, North Boone, Oregon, Stillman Valley, Winnebago. That's an interesting dynamic for Dupec, who's been playing in a 1A, maybe 2A and NUIC, mainly 1A. And they've always kind of been up in 3A when they co-op a very good program. And they've been on the threshold of being almost like a great, quarterfinal type program. But this would certainly be a step up, in competition, at least looking at step up as far as enrollment wise. They play a very tough 1A schedule, but this would be a tough 3A schedule.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of an interesting situation when I look at this, and this is another classification where, man, some of the lines are really strange. District 3 just looks really weird to me on paper.
Yeah.
It's just like, I mean, and you see Wilmington in there. They're another one of those teams that's affected by that little push up that we were talking about before. They're out of 2A. They're into 3. They've been a bubble team for a while, but the 64s put them clearly in 3. But I mean, that's, I was talking to one of the coaches in District 3 about it today, and he's like, if I need a reason to vote against this, this is it. And I said, well, no guarantee, but he's like, I mean, even if they adjust it slightly, it's probably not going to be something we really want to do. Like, and that's kind of where I'm at, because I might be wrong about which teams are put in District 2 and District 3 individually, but it's not like you're going to take a couple of teams out of District 3 and put them in District 8. I mean, the deviation is not going to be that wide. I mean, I could see a way that maybe they slide into that District 4 and some teams get moved around, but who do you take out of District 4? That's where you get into this interesting thing. Like, somebody's got to go with those teams. And, you talked about Montini before. I mean, let's look at there, and, in the grand scheme of things. There's not a single team in there based on that Montini doesn't run in clock on a weekly basis.
Yeah, that's another one, similar to that IC Catholic, district that we referenced. Mitch, what do you think about Princeton's draw here? So it's Dwight, Erie Prophetstown, Mendota, Prairie Central, who's, been a good program over the years. Reed Custer, Seneca, who we've seen firsthand, is a very good program. And Sherrard seems to be kind of on the rise. It's an interesting draw for Princeton.
Yeah, I think it's a tougher district than the division that they're in now, since you're bringing in a little bit of bigger schools, same size schools as them, I should say. Obviously, seeing them in Reed Custer every year would be great. Seeing them in Seneca every year would be great. And then to have some of those traditional track opponents like Erie Prophetstown, Sherrard, Mendota hanging around there. Again, some familiarity there. Same thing with kind of Dupec there in proposed District 1, where you're adding them kind of into the Big Northern a little bit. They just played 3 Big Northern teams in the playoffs. So, but yeah, I think just going back to looking at proposed districts like this one in 3A with Lombard playing a lot of, or that district made up of CPC teams, or Wilmington, same thing, or even in 4A where we're talking about it, where it's even worse. It's just, you see these examples, and I hope that any coach, any school that has not voted yet is looking at these on paper and realizing what this looks like, because this is just, it's madness. It's utter madness.
Yeah, it's weird to me, getting back to Wilmington, to see potentially Wilmington is pretty close to Seneca geographically. They're pretty close to Dwight geographically, and yet they're separated in the districts just by the way they fall. And like you said, this is not a perfect, projection, but it is weird to see that Wilmington's the outlier. For as good as they are, they get in a district, with, let's be honest, not as good of competition as what's sitting right next to them. So And then Monmouth from our area goes down south. They're the last team that kind of gets bumped down. So do you see that holding? I mean, depending on seeing what you've looked at, do you see that Monmouth wouldn't have a way to get fit up in the north? They'd have to go down south.
I don't think that one's perfect. That's
Yeah.
the one where I can easily kind of see a way in my mind where Monmouth would switch to an orange dot and Prairie Central would go to a blue.
Okay.
I could see that. That's just a different interpretation of the map. The reason that I do some of the things that I do with mapping is I'm trying to keep it like where there's not a whole bunch of trips for everybody. Like I'm trying to figure out the smallest circle that I can draw in a lot of ways. And that might not be the way the computer chooses to do it. I could completely see that. I could see a situation where, like I said, you could switch those dots and make complete justification of that. And it wouldn't be something where I'd be like, well, what are you doing? What's going on there? There would be situations where I would shriek about something, but that wouldn't be one of them if that was what they did.
Brink Sportswear offers totally custom made-to-order football uniforms that allow coaches and athletic directors to take control of their brands. The uniforms are available in sublimated and tackle twill. They offer free digital mock-ups, free shipping on team orders, and free physical samples before you buy, so you know exactly how you're spending your program's money. Uniform sets start at $99 for sublimated and $120 for tackle twill. You can find them on Twitter or go to brinksportswear.com. View from the West podcast is also sponsored by the Cupcake Cartel, gourmet cupcakes that are made to order. Over 40 flavors, including wedding cake, lemon blueberry, strawberry milkshake, snickerdoodle, and Oreo. Perfect for weddings, birthdays, showers, fundraisers, or any event. You can find the Cupcake Cartel on Facebook. We thank them for their support.
The Quad City's first and only fantasy football show, For Fantasy's Sake, has you all covered when it comes to all of your fantasy football needs. The guys come to you live every Sunday morning during the football season from 10 to 11:30. They've got the best analysis, rankings, DFS, and gambling advice between the Rock and Mississippi Rivers. So tune into For Fantasy's Sake every Sunday during the football season from 10 to 11:30 a.m. on Facebook and YouTube.
All right, well, let's head to Class 2A now, and that's where we have a lot of our teams, obviously, from the, Three Rivers Athletic Conference, and you have Alleman, the school we talked about at the very beginning of this episode, that the district format would really benefit them. I want to start there. In District 2, that's Alleman, Bureau Valley, Eastland Pearl City, Mercer County, Orion, Riverdale, Rockford Christian, and Rock Ridge. So it's an interesting dynamic here when you're talking about Rock Island Alleman being thrown in there. You have Rockford Christian being thrown in there. But then it's a lot of schools that, we're very familiar with from our part of the state. Mitch, what did you think when you saw this district and the way it was drawn up?
Yeah, so in this particular one here in 2A, we had three schools that responded to our survey with a 4 vote. That would be Riverdale, Alleman, and Rock Ridge. And looking at it, and specifically looking at Sam Graves with Rock Ridge, he brought up a good point that in his time, the track has really gone through a lot of changes. Call it turmoil, call it growth, whatever you want to call it. A traditional 1A, 2A conference is kind of getting into a little bit more 2A, 3A. You get the Kiwanis in there, you're getting into the 4As. His point was that in his time, they've lost Amboy, Fulton, St. Bede, Morrison, and Bureau Valley. In that time, they've gained Princeton, Kewanee, Hall, Mendota, Mercer County coming in this year. So his point being that the landscape is not what it has been. And again, this point is where a lot of these smaller schools are coming with the yes vote or the yes kind of mentality that they would play those like-sized enrollment schools, and it would stop this conference realignments every year. So yeah, we would see if that, again, mock district, we would see a lot of familiar teams. It would put Alleman in a much better situation playing smaller schools.
Yep.
Um, it would realign Bureau Valley a little bit better with teams that they're used to playing. Bring in EPC in that mock up too. So yeah, again, a handful of coaches in this particular mock up district would all be in favor of this sort of setup.
Yeah. Seuss, looking around Class 2A, was there anything that caught your eye?
You know, other than a few weird mapping things, I kind of like 2A. I'll be
Okay.
honest.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are a couple of strange things, and it's based on the fact that you got to have 8. The 8th team, and a couple of them, especially in Southern Illinois, it's like, I don't know what to do here. Kind of hit into a little bit of a, but you know, although I don't think District 1 is very competitive, at least it doesn't create a geographical mess because there are 8 of them.
Yep.
So they fit cleanly there. And while I don't think any of them, to be honest with you, will be much of a factor once we actually get into the postseason, at least they're not causing a mess in the other districts. So that I kind of like. And I kind of like the breaks in most of the other districts, like where it factors out. So you know what this means. The actual districts will look nothing like this.
That you won't like them as much when they get drawn up. But
that's what ultimately will happen here. So, and this is another thing that goes back to, hinging on, the teams that I pulled, did I get them right? When I added to make 512 here, this is where it really starts to get interesting because these districts are pretty precarious. You throw a wild card in here, say, for example, I don't know who it is off the top, might have to look, but what happens if the smallest 3A school needs to come down to 2 to fill a vacancy because I guessed wrong at one of these teams? All this map gets blown up.
Yeah.
Where is that team? Where does it show up on the map? Where does if I had to put another team in there right now in my program that I use, a red star would pop up on the screen, which means it's an unqualified district team. Where does that star show up?
Yeah.
What did I take down? That's when this gets really complicated. So that's where it comes at, because it's like in 2A, I learned today that one of the teams on this field is likely not going to be in this procedure because they're going to go to 8-man. So just by knowing that fact, this changes.
Wow. Okay.
So someone has to replace them.
Interesting. Yeah. And that's a bigger question that we didn't really address earlier, is that, as 8-man continues to grow, is there something that's going to lock these schools in for 2 years where they can't leave? If we go on a 2-year basis, which we kind of assume they will they be locked in, or can they say after 1 year of the, cycle, nope, I'm dropping 8-man. And then what happens to your schedule? Then
I don't think that's the thing. I don't think you can do that. I think you would be
Right.
like, you can't tell a school, oh, you have to play 11-man football. What?
Yeah.
Would you just be putting it into a forfeit loop? That would be what it would be.
Yeah. So looking at District 4, it's a lot of the Lincoln Land Conference that was newly formed this year with Elmwood, Brimfield, Farmington, Illini West, Knoxville, Lewistown Co-op, and Mendon Unity, Tremont, and West Hancock. So overall, that stays pretty close to what we had seen. A few variations in there, but if that were to hold, that wouldn't be too much of an adjustment for, those schools out of the Lincoln Land. And overall, Mitch, I think the Lincoln Land Conference is one of the ones that I'm kind of, if a district were to pass, I'm kind of disappointed for them, because they just found what I think is a really good, working football conference where they merged in and divided bigger and smaller schools. And I think based on the first year, I thought it worked really well.
Yeah, and that was the comment from some of the coaches that we got back, was that they did like it. It's already split into big school and small school. I think I think Bureau Valley would be put in a bad spot, staying on the large school side.
Yeah.
But that would be mute in this
Yep.
model. But yeah, for the most part, it would kind of retain some of that. I'm looking at that proposed District 3, and those are all playoff teams. I mean, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I think
Well,
5 of those 8 made playoffs,
Nightmare's
and
kind of fallen on hard times over the last couple of years, but
yeah,
they didn't make it. And Ridgeview took a step back this year.
right.
So looking at that, you're thinking 3 or 4 years ago, oh my God, like you're
Right.
looking at that. But in current times, there's only 4 teams that made the playoffs this year. So, but I
But
think
I was gonna say same thing in kind of District 5, where you could potentially have Athens if St. Teresa got back to where they were, and rural Forsyth, plus a Quincy Notre Dame team that is always pretty good in 2A. That's a really good district too.
I wonder what Quincy Notre Dame thinks about the district format. Yeah, I didn't send them a message, and I should have. But that's a school that, similar to Quincy High School, they're on kind of an outlier. And I remember way back when we talked to Matt Schuckman, we asked him about district play, and he did not think he wanted it, right? From Muddy River Sports, Matt Schuckman. We just asked him if he thought that Quincy would want it, and he did not think so. But Quincy Notre Dame's an interesting case because they've kind of struggled to find a conference home. So
now they kind of have one. So they're going into the Central State 8 as that 12th team now. So I don't know how great of a fit that is for them, but they do at least have a home now, because I mean, they played more schools from Missouri last year than teams from Illinois. So
yeah,
I'm sure they would rather not do that. But I think I can't speak for them, but I think this would probably be preferred to their. I mean, to the situation that they're going in, but it might be a coin flip type of situation for them.
Yeah. All right. Well, in Class 1A, we'll talk about it. But Souce, you wanted me to remind you that you had a wrinkle in 1 and 2A, so I want to bring that up. Have we talked about it yet?
No, we haven't. So
okay.
I asked several people in augment to this is, what if I'm wrong? What if we're not going to add 12 teams to this equation? What would be the possible solution? And some said, okay, we would take it, we'd crank everybody down to 62, and there'd be neighboring districts of 7 where you could play a crossover. That was one thing that was discussed. The other thing that was discussed is, we fill 8, we fill 7, we fill 6, we fill 5, we fill 4, we fill 3, we fill 2. What is left over is 1.
So what kind of numbers would you be looking at then, and how would you do that?
So the suggestion was that you'd essentially, since we needed 12 teams to fill this, there would be 12 less teams in 1A. I'm not saying that I agree with it or whatever. I'm just saying that it's possible that would be the solution. So what you would need to do in that scenario is take the 12 largest schools in the 1A 64 team group and remove them. They would go up to 2A, and all those teams that I put in, fill the draw, would come out. So those teams would start matriculating into the spots left behind by those public league schools, and you'd be left with, in this scenario, if those numbers held, 52 schools in 1A.
So then what kind of breakdown are we looking at? 52 divided by 8. Where does that...
For example, I've been talking to the Stockton coach about this as a possibility.
Yeah.
Stockton go to 2A.
Oh,
Not
geez.
Stockton, I'm sorry, Fulton.
Fulton. Okay.
Fulton. I've been talking to Patrick about this. So in this hypothetical, Fulton is a 2A team. So you have to remove them, obviously, from the 1A district. You have to figure out how you're going to group 52 teams, because you can't have 18 districts.
Yeah.
It's going to be imbalanced. I'm not saying this would be the solution. I'm saying it was offered as a possible solution. you have to look at it and say, well, if that happens, and I think it's madness, but if that was the way that they went, then throw District 1 out the window, because that's not what you're getting.
Well, let's talk about District 1, because that is very interesting. You have Dakota, Forreston, Fulton, Galena, Lena Winslow, Morrison, Newman Central Catholic, and Stockton. Mitch, you've got to be kidding me when I tell you that teams are going to be left out of the playoffs here. Very deserving teams are going to be left out of the playoffs here. When you start looking at even the districts, around the rest of the state, that there's just going to be teams that are deserving to be in the playoffs. It's like we talked about, that imbalance here. This doesn't work for me. This does not work for me.
No, go back the last 20 years, and the majority of the state championships would have come from teams in that district. Yeah. Either in 1A or 2A, I guess, with Newman and Morrison. Morrison's were both 2A. But Lena, Galena, Forreston, Dakotas were 2A. But I mean, I think I said earlier, I think I counted 24 state championships in that district. So to think that, you're going to leave at least one and potentially two out of the playoffs, where they would beat not anybody, but they would beat Fisher in District 4, and Fisher could get in. It's nonsense. It's nonsense.
In this argument right here next to it, because technically this would be their neighboring district in this situation. And
right.
District 2 and 1A, and I have this stat that I use as a win metric. Collectively, that has the worst win metric of any district in the state, in any classification.
Really?
That is the District 2 has the worst one. That's the worst one right there.
Well, wow. And, Hope had a great year. I don't know what they bring back, but that's...
Yeah, you put together those 8 teams as a group and figure out their number. It's the worst one in the state. Of the 6 districts that we do.
And in that proposed district, look at Rockford Lutheran. They've made the playoffs the past couple of years. They've lost to an NUIC team every time. So it's just like, God.
Yeah.
Mitch needs more Tylenol. He's got that headache. Yeah.
Bottom 5 teams in District 2 combined for 4 wins last year.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're going to send 4 of those teams in playoffs.
Yeah. And then when you start looking at, the gauntlet that is that District 1, District 3, I think on the other side, I think District 3 works out really well for the schools involved. You have Anawan-Weathersfield, Stark County, Rova Williamsfield, Princeville, Monmouth United, and Abingdon that are all common conference opponents currently in the Lincoln Land small side of things. But then you toss in St. Bede, and Fieldcrest is kind of the interesting one there that have they always been 1A, Souce? They've been up higher usually, right?
They are right around that border.
Okay. Yeah.
They constantly flirt with that line. They usually sit right around 300 usually, and they have been higher in the past. Their enrollment was one of those schools that kind of took a little dip, and it's the same thing that kind of I don't know if it's a region thing. It's the same thing that kind of happened with Clifton Central for years and years and years. In a 2A program, there was an enrollment dip that pushed them down into the 1A line. So there were 5 or 6 schools that did that this year, and I don't know the reasoning for it, but those are 2 of the schools that you're right. Usually you think of them in the 2A mindset, but now they're 1A. So yeah.
So there it is. I mean, that's the 8 classes kind of all projected out and how the districts would look. It's not perfect, but Souce, I give you a ton of credit because there are people around the state looking for, answers to, looking for any sort of clue to what they might be voting on. And this is a huge resource here. overall in general, what did you think when you drafted all this up? What did you expect going in? And then what was the results, coming out?
I think one of the things that I really kind of had to wrap my head around when we were talking about this before is to kind of wash away the classifications that I'm used to people being in, because there was going to be some changes here, and I knew there were going to be some changes here because of what we talked about before. The one thing about the conference system that it does is if you have a 4A, 5A, 6A conference, where those are the schools together, doesn't happen every time, but usually the better teams are the 5A teams. You might have a little jump around, but usually you can kind of mark it by enrollment when you have like that big of a gap sometimes in enrollment. And that's the complaint here, is that, we're the teams that are in those conferences, as the smaller schools, are like, we can't get out of this hole that we're in, and as long as it's like this, we're not going to see any change. But the crossover to that is, just because you're moving into that, more like enrollment, doesn't necessarily mean that all your problems are just going to vanish away. Like, you might just run into a bunch of programs in this system that are the same size as you, but still better than you. Like, it becomes, and that was kind of the dynamic that I kind of had to wrap my head around. The biggest problem that I experienced were, a lot of times you look at this map, you look at the dots before I colorize them, and the best solution for districts was, there are 7 teams here. There are 6 teams here that belong together. But I need to figure out a way to get these 4 that are over here. So not only am I inconveniencing the 4 teams that I kept in that district with the outlier 4, I'm also screwing over the other 2 that are more natural fits with the 4 that I just took out to make that district. So that's where the conference system is superior, because you can flex it in a way that makes it work for the teams that you have there. You can form a 16 conference. You can form an 18 conference. You can form 2 divisions of 6 teams. You can do a lot of different things. The rigidness of 8, there were numerous situations where you look at these maps, there are 9 dots that are perfectly affixed in an area with one another, and gotta pull someone from that group because I need 8. 9 doesn't work. And it's just, that's where you get into it. And then the other layering to this, and like, I don't know what the solution is. Like, if we end up going to a district situation, I haven't figured out what I think the best solution would be here. People ask me that all the time. Well, if you were in charge of it, what would you do? I think one of the things that I would do, and I don't know if this would fly, but since we're throwing stuff against the wall and see if it sticks, let's try this. I think we should put 1s and 2s together, 3s and 4s together, 5s and 6. The gaps are not that wide, especially when you consider, hey, let's designate everybody in the classification that they want. All right. Okay. And then just put them in these 1s and 2s districts. And then the best 32 teams that come out of that process that are designated 1A are your playoff qualifiers.
Yeah, right? I can see that working.
You finish 5th in a district that you're in as a 1A. If your metrics set, if you were 5-4 with 32 playoff points, and that's one of the best teams that was designated as 1A, you go in. Like, it would give more flexibility. It would eliminate the need to stick to these hard numbers of 10, or just it would give you more chances and opportunities to form smaller groups, and it wouldn't be so rigid. Like, I mean, I don't know if I would have to flesh this out, but that's something that I've always kind of been kicking around in my head. Is like, the thing that makes me kind of scream about this is, we want to be in like enrollment. In 2A, do you know the gap between the smallest 2A school and the largest 2A school?
Nope.
89 students.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
All
So,
right.
yeah.
Not very
You're not-
wide.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So when we're looking at this, one question that I meant to ask earlier, when we form, depending on the number we end up with, if it's 512, we obviously know what we're getting. That's the goal, I think, or that's the idea, I should say. But if we don't have that, does every class has to have each district with the same number, correct?
Well, I think what would have to happen in that situation is you would have to drop, let's just say, just for sake of argument, you would have to drop six. Let's just say let's just say we have 500. We
Okay.
don't add any of the public league schools. Let's just say that. My suggestion in that scenario would be how would you deal with this? Okay, I would suggest like this. You do one of your IHSA drops, your little P drops that they do to set the brackets. 2 classes stay at 64. Random draw. All right. The other 6 go to 62. All right. And then you take 2 districts and make them 17 districts. All right.
Yeah.
And then you put them neighboring each other geography wise. So then the teams that have a bye week on that week simply cross over against the other neighboring district to fill that game.
Okay.
Then towards the district standings, it just gives you a scheduled game. So you don't have to take a bye or a loss in that situation, because it would be unfair to count the crossover game because everybody would have different crossover opponents. It would also screw up your tiebreaker.
Okay.
So that would be my solution. If you said, how do you fix this? That would be what I would suggest that you do. If you have 500 teams, if you have 498, then you take 1 P out and keep it at 64 and make the other one 62. Like, that would be my solution. If anybody asks, nobody's going to. I've clearly designated that. But that would be the way that I would do it if asked. Like the 1A, 2A thing that I was talking about before, I'd want to hang that up with a noose. I mean, that would just that would want me to just I don't know what I would do in that situation, because I don't know how you make that designation. But the biggest challenge, I think, in that situation would be figuring out the most fair way to decide who goes up, who stays down. And I think that's the fairest solution in that situation.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I hate the idea of just, working your way down and then 1A just gets the scraps, whatever's left. Like, that seems just like a slap in the face to small schools. Like, that, it doesn't really matter. We'll just leave you with whatever's left. Like, that seems wrong to me.
The other kicker to that is like, then you could have other classifications that are like, well, hey, wait a minute. We have 32 non-qualifiers to the playoffs, and these guys only have 18. What the hell, bro?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's like that's where that kind of the rubber doesn't hit the road for me either, because like, you have to lessen the number of teams and districts. You'd probably end up getting into a situation where you have 6 team and 17 districts, and then you've got messy situations where you might have. Here's a terrifying one for you. If you have 6 team districts, there would be a scenario where you could get into the playoffs at 2-7. So I'm not gonna do that one for you. That one, I know that one would want I'm gonna make your partner there pass out. So,
well, I mean, I saw that type of thing played out in the state of Iowa when I was covering high school football over there. I saw it play out that way. We have gone long. This has been an absolute deep dive. Mitch, I'll get, and actually, Souce, before we, you said no one's going to ask you, your thoughts, but I did have a head coach say, if Souce could do whatever he wanted, what would he do? And you already kind of addressed it. You already kind of said what you would do if you had the reins to do scheduling, regular season, postseason, all of it. So I think it's interesting. I think people are interested in what you think would work best.
I think if I was made the all-powerful warlord of IHSA football, I think I would work in the current system to try to get a better answer. I think there are some fixes that could be made to the current system if everyone was open to it, that would make it a better experience for a lot of people. I can't solve all the problems, but districts don't solve all the problems either. The current system doesn't solve all the problems. We are not going to be able to create a system where everyone's going to be happy.
Yep.
Like it's not, it doesn't exist. It does not exist. That's the thing that frustrates me. I think if we don't pass the district system, what is going to happen moving forward is we're going to have to come up with some way to, I guess the best word I can use to describe it is arbitrate civil issues. Because the problem that we're continually running into right now is everyone's chasing the 5. I don't like that terminology, but more so than chasing the 5, all programs seem to have a different interpretation of what a competitive football game is. Like, I want a competitive game is what they tell me when they're looking for the game, but they don't like the first 5 options that I give them that I think are competitive games. Like, I'm trying to find a solution for you. You're trying to find the perfect path for your week 3 vacancy. I'm trying to tell you there isn't a perfect path at this point. I'm trying to give you the best possible solution, and you get resistance, and then you end up teams going to Wisconsin and Michigan, and they don't have to. Like, yeah, there are some situations that you have to go to Missouri if you're over by the Missouri border, but no, that you don't. We're going to have to get into a situation where we say, okay, I can't find a week 2 game, and I'm not saying it's got to be me, it's somebody. I need a solution. Can you give me 4 options amongst the available schools that are here? And you're saying when you submit to this process, I'm going to take one of those 4 schools. Like, move forward. Instead of this dance that goes on, because if we don't do this, there are schedule problems that have to be resolved. I'm not blind to that. I understand. But people need to be more flexible when you are in need of a game than trying to like I won't name a program name, but let's just say there's a 1-8 team out there that doesn't have a week 2 game. We got to stop having this shark feeding frenzy of every team that has a vacancy calling up the 1-8 saying play us. That's got to stop. We got to start having some unions of these teams that, maybe it is a risk, but if there's another team that went 4-5 last year and you went 4-5 last year, guess what? That's a perfectly acceptable solution to an open date. Go play. Stop looking for that. I mean, maybe you'll win the game. Okay. Like, stop thinking in the pejorative, that's that. Like I said, I know it's a problem. Like, at the end of the day, I hope that this system does not go through. I think there are too many variables and too many things that are not answered. And I think what will end up happening if it does go through is that there will be a bylaw proposal on next year's legislative to reverse it and send it back. Like, and then we'll be back in this whole discussion again. Like, and I'd also like to know, out of all of this stuff that bothers me, people are complaining all the time about all these conference shifts and all this other stuff. Why do we have to have football teams and all other sports in the same conference? Why does it have to be that way? Like, I know some conference bylaws are written that way, but why does it have to be that way?
That's a great question.
Why can't you build football only conferences and leave the rest of your stuff alone?
Yeah. I know that, it has happened. It's not unprecedented. It's just, you're right. It's rare. Well,
that's what you're doing here.
Absolutely.
You're just calling it a different thing. So why is it okay if it's district football, but it's not okay to do that in the conference system? I don't get it. I've never understood that.
Well, Mitch, I know kind of what your thoughts are, but any final thoughts as you look at all this? I mean, we've broke it all down. We've gone through every class. You've seen it all now.
Yeah, I think Seuss's point to that, we're just kind of shifting problems, or we're slowing them down, is what we're doing. Right. Going to districts doesn't solve schools going through periods of low enrollment or low football participation. So we're still going to have those problems. You're still going to have schools that drop to 8A. Like Seuss mentioned, there's a team already out there who is unannounced who might do it.
Yeah.
You're still going to have that. You're still going to have schools that need to co-op. Districts doesn't solve that. And so I've never understood what districts ultimately solves, because I don't think it relieves the IHSA of some of the underlying issues that programs go through. And it's not the IHSA's fault, right? These are just things that communities go through, especially smaller communities, or private schools that end up like Addison Driscoll, right? Those things happen. Districts won't solve that. So if I was king for the day, I would keep the model we have. I'd go 1 through 32 to balance the competition a little bit once you get to playoffs. Maybe you tweak the multiplier so you aren't seeing Althoff Catholic in 1A, or you're not seeing Bloomington in 2A. And again, I hope that if there's a school, a coach, an AD who has not voted yet with 2 weeks to go, one, saw Seuss's article that finally put theory on paper. Maybe they've listened to this show, other shows, whatever, that have painted a picture a little bit clearer now, and realize that you cannot vote for this sight unseen. You can't do it. It will only make it worse. And like Sue says, then next year you'll have a bylaw proposal to revert back, and it'll just be nonsense. So again, I hope there's enough momentum that the schools that are for it they might not ever be in that mentality that, staying in the current model is the best option for them. But I don't think that they ultimately realize the other side of that coin. So we'll see what happens in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think, to wrap it all up for me, it kind of goes back to where this all started. I think there's just too many unknowns. There's just, outside of these, projections that have been drawn up, no one really has, any concrete, information. And when you take it a step further, no one has any answers to these questions. And if I'm an athletic director or a coach, a high school football coach, trying to make this decision, again, I understand some schools, it's a no-brainer. Some programs, they can't wait to get into a district model because it saves their program, or it greatly enhances their, competition and their ability to compete. And it kind of levels the playing field for them. On the opposite side, I understand why some are terrified of this, why it's a completely bad fit, and it makes zero sense. And I think that somewhere in the middle, there's these schools that they could go either way, and maybe they like the idea of some parts of the district model. But I just think, from what I've seen, even if you kind of like the district model, I just can't see it working for enough schools. There's just too many hiccups and too many unanswered questions with, the competitive balance, when it looks at the strength of these districts potentially. And if we don't have answers to these questions, I can't see going through with it. And I just don't understand how we can make a vote without enough information with it, So Mitch, what do you?
I wish the proposal was to propose that the IHSA draw them up and then vote on that, right? The proposal would be for, hey, can the IHSA draw up a potential district situation? And then the following year or whatever, they would vote on that. It just seems like there's too many red flags with this that is trying to be pushed through to be implemented in 8 months. It just doesn't seem right to me. There's something missing there.
Well, and the irony is that, a lot of people want to push for district scheduling, so they kind of know, year in and year out who their opponents are, where their opponents are coming from. But yet in this current situation, we're going to rush this through and not have an idea of who's playing who until what? Could be January, February, Seuss?
Oh, I think it might even be later than that.
And that's unbelievable to
And
not know what your schedule is going to be.
we have to, I mean, we got to get it out there somewhat quickly because you've got a lot of legwork that you've got to do. You've got to make arrangements with some of these schools that you've never dealt with before. It's not as easy as just flipping your conference page over and going, okay, you're at home
Right.
this year, I'm at away.
Right.
I mean, you've got all these new relationships that you've got to build in some cases,
Yeah.
and all this logistical stuff that you have to figure out. Plus, you still haven't relieved yourself of some scheduling responsibility. Still have to schedule those 2 games, and for some of these schools, it's a slam dunk. Some of the other ones, it's not. You're gonna have to find somebody. It's still gonna be this. All this stuff fundamentally, for the most part, has been done in the current system. So you might just look at your schedule and say, okay, we'll just go with the first 2 weeks. Well, maybe you can't do that because maybe that team is in your district now. Maybe it isn't. Maybe that team doesn't want to play you anymore. They want to play somebody else. So, I mean, there's just stuff that needs to be done. But Sam himself admitted to me, he says, we got to wait for a lot of dust to clear before we put something out there. And I know from experience, because usually this is when I start putting together, trying to start piecing together my schedule for the next year, pulling it together from wherever information that I can find. There are variables that do not get resolved in this until at the earliest April or May.
Yeah.
Like Chicago Public League, if you think you're going to get a concrete answer from them on who's going to be playing in February, I got some swampland to sell you. It's not going to happen. I mean, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I just think if coaches are complaining or worried now about scheduling, oh boy, wait till you have to compete to schedule the other teams. Like we talked a lot about Moline and Rocky, right? Well, there's a bunch of teams that are going to be trying to schedule Rocky. There's a bunch of teams that are going to be trying to schedule Moline. That's not going to be a guarantee that those 2 teams play each other every year. One of those 2 teams could get a better offer or whatever, a better opportunity from somebody else. Rocky had a down year. Maybe Moline doesn't want to play Rocky while they're down. So that's not automatic. So to think that the scheduling woes go away by doing this, I think it almost makes them worse, especially from like an NUIC standpoint where you're playing a 9-game conference schedule. Well, now you have to find 2 games.
Yeah, true.
One thing that I will say for it, at least in that sense, at least people will be less likely to be like, oh, I'm not playing you out of fear.
Sure.
Because at least you'd be more open to, but there's still, whatever we do, still 250 pairings have to be made of teams in those 2 weeks. And right now, unlike the current schedule, which I don't know all the answers, but in most years, I'd probably have 175, 200 of those dates filled right now. I have 0 of them filled now, in the distance. None of them are filled. None of them are officially filled because nobody knows what district they're in. Nobody knows for sure what classification they're going to be in. So even having conversations about some of these games is kind of pointless.
Yeah. And each passing hour, there would be weeks already filled. While you're waiting for some team to say yes or no, there's 6 other potential opponents that already found their game while you're waiting for one decision. So it'll be impossible. It'll be impossible, and it won't solve the problem that they're complaining that they have now.
Yeah. Again, I can see why some schools would want it, but in general, as I look at it, it's too many unknowns. And again, like we just have talked about, the rush of trying to get it in next football season, it seems like a mistake. It seems like I like you said it. You said the phrase, Mitch, there's red flags there. Like, why are we rushing this? Why couldn't we have put it on as a proposal and said it will go in place in 2025? So we have plenty of time to draft something up, to take a look at it, and to get it, to its best possible solution. But it just doesn't seem like, I don't know, that isn't the plan. And I don't agree with that.
It's kind of funny too, because it's like when I look at it, I'm like, it would just make logistical sense to try to plan this for the next 2-year enrollment period, because you're going to have all of these teams' numbers that are going to change. The multiplier factors are going to change on programs. So all of these districts that we craft are only going to be accurate for 1 year.
That makes no sense. Yeah.
And you're going to have to blow it up and start all over again and have new districts for everybody. So you're not even setting up a 2-year arrangement. You're just setting up a 1-year arrangement. And then next year, your entire district may change. So then you have to go back and reset all the relationships again. And because multipliers will factor in, enrollments will change. And with some of these borders so close and tight together, 10 teams might swap classes. Like you might have 10 new teams in 2A and 10 new teams in 3A, and then the maps get all swirled around, and you're going to be doing that for 1 year. Because that's when the enrollment numbers change. So to me, that it just seems like there's a lot of things, and I know why they did it the way that they did it, but there's a lot of things that I would have been like, if I truly believe this is improvement for Illinois high school football, I'll show you how it's an improvement, and then we'll implement it when we have the new numbers, the new multipliers, the new success formulas, all those things in place, and then we'll give you a real look at what you're going to get. But nobody can do that right now. I can't do that right now. No one can do that right now. There's just too many wild variants in here to have such a rigid plan without caveats. Like, this is what bothers me the most about this proposal. It was written very similar to the last one, and it doesn't address, okay, what will we do in this situation? It's leaving too much levity, and I don't even think the IHSA wants that levity. I think they're saying, please write us a proposal that says, what do we do in this situation? Because what's going to end up, what's happening to the IHSA right now isn't really fair to them. Because people yelling at the IHSA for not doing all this work. It's not their responsibility to do this proposal for the people that are suggesting this proposal. If these people want change, then it's their responsibility to demonstrate what they want that change to be.
Yep, exactly.
So, people are chewing out the IHSA for not putting out a mock. I don't know if that'd be their responsibility in this situation. It wasn't asked for. Yeah.
Yeah, send that to Muhammad Seymour.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you want to point the finger as to the solution, well, have the people who are proposing it draw it up, not the IHSA. I mean, they're going to have to. You're forcing their hand now.
Yeah.
What if they do something that you didn't want done?
Right.
You find yourself blame.
Yeah. I was just going to say what happens next, Seuss? The voting is open until the 18th, which is 2 weeks away. Will we know on the 19th? I mean, will it be that quick? Okay.
Yes. The vote will turn around on the 19th. I was told that if it does pass, do not expect anything quickly. And when I say quickly, like, I don't expect to see actual districts until March. That's the timeline that I believe it would be on.
Yeah. Man, and that just seems crazy to me that, for the clamoring for stability and to, know who you're playing year in and year out. And here we would go setting this up and having zero idea who you're playing, which we already established. So I don't know. It's just a lot. Yeah. It's a lot to understand, to try to wrap your head around when there's, very few answers, in the proposal. So anyway, have we exhausted this? I can't believe, Mitch, we've had some long episodes, but this might be a record here.
This is pushing 3 hours. Yeah. It's probably our longest one, but maybe the most consequential one, right? In terms of the impacts that we're talking about here. So it's important. Well, again, I don't know how many listeners that we have that'll make it all 3 hours, but I hope that it, again, gives proper insight to what is being discussed.
Yeah.
You did solve one mystery for me tonight, gentlemen. I didn't know if anybody could talk about this as much as I do. So
you want to talk public-private for another 2 hours?
That's that I'll happily join in that debate whenever you boys decide to have it. I like I said, I will talk about this stuff until I'm purple. I mean, it won't. I'll keep going. Like if you said, hey, let's go another hour, I'm down. Let's roll.
I love it. I was going to say, you
Depending
got
on the
going.
vote, we're going to have to.
Yeah, we'll be back again. I think hitting record on the 19th to break this all down and see what is decided. But no, Souce, I can't thank you enough for joining us. Steve Soucie from Friday Night Drive. This has been great. I appreciate your knowledge. I appreciate the projections you've drawn up and provided for everyone in the state. Like I said, it's a compliment to support local journalism because that's where it's coming from. You know, if you're getting the answer, you know, if you're getting any sort of answers, that's where it's coming from. So great work there. Thank you for talking, you know, for staying up with us to talk through it.
Well, this is early for me. I got no problems. I'm a night owl by nature. So I still got another 2-3 hours in me. I'm good.
I was going to say, I followed along on some Friday nights that pushed into the, 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. So, and it's always an hour later for Mitch, who records in Ohio. So he's, he's always pushing the,
We're pushing 1 a.m. So it's fine. I'm like Souce.
I'm out of training though, because I actually train myself in the football season because I expect to be up till like 3 o'clock in the morning on Friday nights. But I'm out of shape right now because I'm doing that as often as I usually do. But I'll be fine. But like I said, if this is the topic of discussion, like I said, I will go all freaking day if I find willing participants that don't get tired of me and basically say, "Hey, shut up! I'm tired of listening."
Well, we love to deep dive any topic here, and I'd say if we're gonna do it, we're gonna do it right, and we're gonna talk about it. So I think we did it right. This was a great conversation, and we did just talk public-private, but maybe sometime we'll have to invite you on to get your insights because you see a lot of different things around the state that we don't see firsthand every year and every week. So
this would just ignite it even worse. The districts would just ignite it even worse.
Yeah.
He's absolutely right. There's the problems that people have with you're forcing teams now because now you're forced to play them. If you don't want to play them, you're forced to play them in the playoffs. Now you're forcing them to do it again. You're forcing them to play that in the regular season and then get to the playoffs and play them again. And you don't want to do that. So if that's your program philosophy, I just don't want to deal with them. Well, now you're double forcing that upon them. So it's only that argument is only going to get more labored and more consternated.
Oh boy, we're going to have a lot more to talk about. Well, Mitch, I meant to make the programming note at the beginning. To anyone still listening this far in, first of all, thank you. If you're looking for our View from the West awards episode, we pushed that back a week. That'll be next week. We'll talk awards. We'll hand out all our awards for the football season, the 23 football season. We felt like we had to jump in and talk districts here. So we'll be back next week talking awards. But for now, we're going to be waiting and I'm sure following along the debates, the discussion on Twitter about what works, what doesn't work with this district format. Thank you to everyone who listened, who followed along. We really appreciate it. Hope you leave this podcast a little more informed, a little more educated. And if you have the ability to vote, hopefully we've, given you the information you need to know or that you wanted to know going into the vote for sure. So, Souce, thank you again. This has been great. We'll have to do it again in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for having me, guys. It was a really great talk and I was glad to have it.
Awesome. All right. Well, Mitch, we'll talk again next week. Start thinking about your best ofs.
Yep. No question.
All right. We'll see you then. Thank you, everyone. That'll do it for this week's episode of View from the West. Thank you so much for listening. I encourage you to go out to Apple Podcasts or Podbean and subscribe so you can follow along and downloads will come automatically every week. You can follow along on Twitter at ViewFromWestPod. You can also email me if you're interested in being a sponsor, viewfromwestpod@gmail.com. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week.